thank you so much for coming. My name's Kristen Lawler. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Left Forum. We are so excited about this panel tonight. The activists and thinkers and organizers who are up on this stage right now are just beyond. So I'm not going to talk very long because I want us to get right to it. But I would like to take this opportunity quickly to thank our media partners who are making it so that the Left Forum and the panels and the plenary sessions like tonight can be seen and heard all over the place. So we'd like to thank Deep Dish TV, the Real News Network, Sirius XM Progress, Channel 127, Telesur, WBAI. Thank you so much, everybody, for broadcasting from the Left Forum. Let's give them a hand. Thank you. Okay, also one more quick acknowledgement and thank you. We have a number of very important families who are here tonight. And a gentleman named Uncle Bobby Grant has led a very special delegation here to the Left Forum. And on behalf of all of us, I'd just like to thank the families of the following victims of racist gun and state violence. I'm going to read the names, and then I'd like us to just give a hand to the families who came here to the Left Forum, did 2 panels today. We're just so honored for you to be here. The families of Kenneth Chamberlain, Kendrick Johnson, Michael Brown, Ramarley Graham, Oscar Grant, Sean Bell, Andrew Joseph III, and Jordan Davis. So let's give those families a hand. Okay, and the last thing that I have the pleasure to do up here is to introduce our tonight's moderator and interlocutor for the plenary. Paul Jay is CEO and senior editor of the Real News Network with its headquarters in Baltimore. I know, yeah, the Real News Network, it's the greatest. The Real News Network is independent of political parties, viewer-supported, and not-for-profit. It does not accept advertising, government, or corporate funding. This funding model allows for uncompromising broadcast journalism. Its mission is to be a daily video news service, online and on television, engaging a mass audience in solving the critical problems of our time. Prior to the Real News Network, Jay was, for 10 seasons, the creator and executive producer of CBC News World's flagship debate programs, Face Off and Counterspin, an award-winning filmmaker and founding chair of Hot Docs Documentary Film Festival. So please join me in welcoming Paul Jay.
I should say that. If anyone wants translation in Spanish, there are headsets at the back. I should know that because I was here last night and everybody was complaining about that. All right, is that better? Thank you. Hi, everybody. Before I get started, I've been asked to speak a little bit to contextualize this evening. I would like to just quickly welcome our panel, and then I'll more fully introduce them as each one speaks. So, on the far end, we have Kshama Sawant. Glen Ford. Makayla Gilliam-Price. Tangi McHarris. And Alicia Garza. If I have to eat the mic, I have to move this over a bit. For those of you that watch the real news know, usually all I have to do is sit and ask questions. And I don't often have to speak to crowds this big. So I'm going to kind of read a script, which normally I don't like to do, but I think it will be better. The world has heard the name of Freddie Gray, who was brutally murdered by Baltimore police. Here's another name everybody should know: Rodney Todd. Mr. Todd lived in Princess Anne, Maryland. It's about 130 miles southeast of Baltimore. Rodney was described by his family and friends as a devoted father and a disciplined, hard worker. Rodney couldn't afford to pay his electric bill. He'd been cut off by the Delmarva Power Company. He bought an electric generator to give some light and some warmth to his children. He was a single father. Why he ran the generator inside his house isn't clear, but his neighbors speculate it was because the generator would be too loud and would keep his neighbors up at night. Rodney Todd and his 5 young girls and 2 young boys died of carbon monoxide poisoning. They were last seen alive on March 28th of this year. Their bodies were found a few days later. The media reports focused on whether the Delmarva Company had illegally shut off his power. In Maryland, during winter months, non-payment of a bill is not legal cause to cut the cord. The power company said it was because it was a safety issue with his meter. They also said Rodney had never tried to set up an account for his electricity. And while it's criminal, or at least it should be criminal, to shut the power off to a family under any circumstances, it's even more criminal that a working person can't afford to pay their electric bill. Rodney Todd, an African-American worker, was paid $8 an hour for a full-time job. That's Maryland's current minimum wage. He was supporting 7 kids on $8 an hour. What the major media didn't ask is, why was Rodney working for $8? When Baltimore exploded after the death of Freddie Gray, CNN and other such media outlets, when they weren't accusing the protesters of being thugs and criminals, which was most of the time, paid lip service to the fact that the underlying condition of poverty and the savaging of communities by drugs, and they should have added by the war on drugs, helped create the anger expressed on the streets of Baltimore. What they didn't address is why poverty in Baltimore and cities across the country is chronic. Why did Rodney Todd work for $8 an hour? Why are people working at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, cleaning surgical rooms, taking special drugs so they don't get HIV, for $13 an hour after having worked at Johns Hopkins for 14 years? Because people are desperate for jobs. There's a class of people that makes money out of unemployment. The more desperate people are, the less money they're willing to work for. Why are communities in Baltimore and across the country faced with chronic drug addiction and gang warfare? Well, same answer. There's an enormous amount of money being made out of the war on drugs. The mass incarceration system, police, lawyers, judges. The for-profit bail bonding industry is a multi-billion-dollar business backed by major insurance companies and trade associations with the money and political power needed to shape the criminal justice system to serve their interests. In Baltimore, it's only within the last year that a person had a right to be represented at all at a bail hearing. Get that? Only within the last year. Most people who couldn't afford a lawyer were not given a public defender at their bail hearing. The bail was just set by a commissioner, rubber stamped by a judge, and that was the end of it. Now, most people are getting public defenders, but they're lucky if they see them for more than 5 minutes before the bail hearing, and I'm told by public defenders on Monday morning The public defenders often have to represent 150 people that they find out at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they don't see them until 9 a.m., and the hearing starts about 15 minutes later. And then they're supposed to make some coherent argument on bail. It's not unusual over a $20 dispute for a person to get a $25,000 of bail. In Baltimore City Jail, a prisoner is not allowed a visit for 90 days except for seeing a lawyer. No family, no friends for 90 days. If you're represented by a public defender, you're likely not to see them again until just a few days before you go to trial. What does this create? More money made out of desperation, people willing to pay bail bondsmen to get out of hellish prison. The front line of this war to keep people poor is the police. Police violence against people of color, particularly, that is illegal violence, usually goes without any consequences to the perpetrators. And it's not merely the product of too many law enforcement officers with racist attitudes. Their name says it all. Police are enforcing laws, including with deadly force, to make people obey legislation that at its heart protects people's private property. The more you own, the more you are served and protected. When police use violence, they do so as agents of a legal system that must keep a lid on people who fight back against such desperate conditions. Whether they fight back blindly and often self-destructively, or consciously and politically, the elites have passed laws that keep people in their place. Of course, the place for those in the elites, that is the top 20%, is to own 85% of America's wealth. On a global scale, the top 1% of the population owns 50% of the world's wealth. In the US, the wealthiest 1% captured 95% of post-financial crisis growth since 2009, while the bottom 90% became poorer. Laws are designed to make sure this inequality takes place, and it makes sure it stays that way, and the police enforce these laws. It's crucial to the elites that police feel free to use violence without much reservation. They don't want them second-guessing themselves. That's why a whole set of laws have been enacted that make it almost impossible to convict a cop of using too much force. The charges that were laid recently in Baltimore are a complete anomaly. We'll wait and see if they stand. But the kind of things that happened to Freddie Gray happen and have happened every day in Baltimore. It takes a Katrina or a militant mass protest for corporate media to acknowledge race in America, even though racism is inseparable from the issue of poverty and policing. This society dehumanizes those it exploits. Racism is the ultimate dehumanization of those who are super exploited. It justifies poverty-level wages, mass unemployment, and mass incarceration. It divides people of color from all those suffering desperate conditions. People are resisting. The powerful movements that have raised the slogan, "No justice, no peace," in Ferguson, Baltimore, and across the country have shaken American politics out of its lethargy. But resistance is not enough. People in many places are setting their sights on power. Only through governing can laws be changed, and force, that's right, force, the police, the courts, and the prisons, used to enforce laws that insist on more equality. When one looks at contemporary experience around the world, significant change comes about by combining mobilization in the streets with the ballot box. And perhaps Latin America is the best example right now. This does not mean becoming an appendage of the Democratic Party. While nationally this may look almost impossible at this time, at least at the level of cities and certain states, it's imaginable. It's possible to imagine a powerful movement with an electoral strategy. People are making demands, and so they should. Communities are calling for community control of the police, saner drug laws, and policies that will create decent jobs. At best, the elites make won't make more than minor changes, although that's better than nothing. The problem is, in the current situation, they won't even do that. Why? Capitalism has lost its dynamism. Far too few people own far too much. And that's the root of the problem. The class that owns so much, that wields so much political power, is not capable of affecting policy in the interests of the majority of people. The top 20% are not even capable of effective policy in their own interests, in the interests of their own class. They can't deal with systemic threats to the very system that made them so wealthy. Nothing makes this more obvious than their inability to regulate the banking system or to deal with carbon emissions. They are fractured, different billionaires and pools of capital, and that political class that represents them bicker and claw for even more money and power. They unite around a policy of global dominance that destroys whole societies, driving them into perverse medievalism, all in the name of promoting freedom and democracy. Not capable of facing up to economic stagnation or the threat of climate change, war is the only answer they have. Our ruling elites are dysfunctional. They're not fit to rule. Working people of all backgrounds are thirsting for a realistic vision to fight for. And it's from ordinary people like these that real change will come from. The history of struggle in the United States has shown that the super-exploited, Black and Latino workers, will be at the heart and the driving force of this change. They must also be the leadership. The resistance in Ferguson and Baltimore have opened up a new horizon for building an independent movement for transformational change. And I hope tonight we can address some of the critical issues facing those in the midst of this struggle. So I'm joined tonight by an outstanding panel who are leading voices in building such a movement. And it's my honor to introduce them. I've already introduced them. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. And speaker by speaker, I'll do their full biographies. So our first speaker is Alicia Garza. She's an organizer, writer, and freedom dreamer, living and working in Oakland, California. She's the Special Projects Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the nation's leading voice for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States, most of whom are women. She's also the co-creator of Black Lives Matters. Not I should say. What should I say? See, boy, I actually do know this. I'm not that old. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. A national organizing project focused on combating anti-Black state-sanctioned violence. Alicia's work challenges us to celebrate the contributions of Black queer women's work within popular narratives of Black movements and reminds us that the Black radical tradition is long, complex, and international. Her activism reflects organizational strategies and visions that connect emerging social movements without diminishing the specificity of structural violence facing Black lives. So, Alicia, please.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let's try that again. There's a lot of y'all in here. Good evening. That's better. First, I want to start off by just saying thank you. Thank you to the families who are here. Thank you, Uncle Bobby, for organizing folks to be here. It's not a light thing, y'all. It's not a light thing. These are families who are grieving the loss of their loved ones and also freedom dreaming at the same time. That's not an easy task, so thank you for doing that. Also, thank you to the Left Forum for having me. I want to start off by talking a little bit about this moment. But I always think it's important to root this moment in history, because we don't want ahistorical narratives floating around out there. So the first one is maybe an obvious one, which is, maybe it's not so obvious, that Black Lives Matter is much more than a hashtag. In fact, it's an organized network in 26 cities globally. It's also intended to be a tactic to help rebuild the Black liberation movement. BLM, BLM. For this generation, including myself, we come up in a particular set of conditions. And we need to understand those conditions, right? So my generation comes up during the rise of neoliberalism. My generation comes up during the rise of the war on drugs. My generation emerges during the period of the consolidation of the right wing. My generation emerges also during the rise of technology. When we talk about this movement, when we talk about, is this a movement or a moment, I think we need to contextualize. Black folks have been being murdered since we were brought here. This is not a new phenomenon. It is an extension of an ongoing problem, which can be simplified to say it's the devaluation of Black lives. But it can be complicated to say that it's really a part of a plan to subvert, to oppress, and in some cases, many cases, especially now, to extinguish Black lives, to get rid of us. Black Lives Matter starts in 2013 when George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Martin. But again, if we root this in historical conditions, Black Lives Matter was present when Oscar Grant was murdered 3 blocks from my house. Black Lives Matter was present when Rodney King was brutally beaten on television in 1992, when Sean Bell was murdered on his wedding day, when Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times. And of course, it's not just our brothers who are being murdered. We should absolutely call the names of people like Tanisha Anderson, Miriam Carey, Shelley Fry, Yvette Smith, Rekia Boyd, Tarika Wilson, Ayanna Stanley Jones, she was 7. Pearl Underwood, she was 92. And let's not forget our transgender brothers and sisters and folks of all genders. We must call the names of people like Lamia Beard and Maya Hall, Michelle Payne and Ty Underwood, Jessie Hernandez and Penny Proud. Again, this is not a new phenomenon. Black Lives Matter also emerges not just after Trayvon was murdered, but after the murder of Jordan Davis, the murder of Renisha McBride, after Cece McDonald was thrown in prison for defending herself against a racist and homophobic attacker, after Marissa was put in jail for defending her life. In Ferguson, frontline activists take Black Lives Matter as a slogan to describe the pain and the frustration of what it means to still be living under Jim Crow. Activists use it to inform their organizing. And then it gets adopted by the mainstream media to describe a movement against police terrorism, which is important. It's important that Black lives make the news in other ways beyond our deaths and our tragedies. And at the same time, it obscures what the fight is actually about. The fight absolutely is about eradicating police violence and police terrorism. The fight is absolutely about eliminating the criminalization of Black people and people of color and other oppressed peoples. But honestly, this fight is about Black liberation. And if I'm to be honest with you, that cannot be relegated to a hashtag. When we created Black Lives Matter, its intent was not to be limited to narrow visions of what state violence looks like, but it was intended to encompass the struggle for human dignity and self-determination. We understand state violence as criminalization, but we also understand state violence as austerity. We understand state violence as patriarchy and white supremacy and imperialism. Let me break that down. We understand state violence as thousands of people in Detroit who lack water, thousands of people in Baltimore who lack access to water. We understand state violence as the attack on public sector unions and on our labor movement. We understand state violence as the lack of access to quality housing, quality education, quality jobs, to a future. It's not possible for a world to emerge where Black Lives Matter if it's under capitalism. And it's not possible to abolish capitalism without a struggle against national oppression and gender oppression. So the fight against police terror, police violence, state violence is but one front of many. And it is our duty as human beings, as leftists, to ensure that the fight against police terror and criminalization is connected to the conditions of Black communities for the sake of the reemergence of a vibrant, effective, powerful Black liberation movement. Y'all don't hear me though. It is essential to connect the fight against police terror and criminalization to the conditions that exist in Black communities and have existed in Black communities since we were brought here as slaves. For the sake of the reemergence of a powerful, effective, vibrant Black liberation movement. Black Lives Matter is in our tradition of call and response. It is a response to the virulent anti-Black racism and state-sanctioned violence that plagues our communities, but it is also a call to action. We hear a lot, people asking us, well, what are the demands? Who are your leaders? Look around. What are the demands? Let's start with stop killing us. But again, when we connect the conditions of criminalization to the conditions in Black communities, it enables us to broaden what needs to be a vibrant human rights movement. Criminalization is the way that Black bodies have been forced from the formalized economy. It's also a way to subvert and abolish the Black liberation movement. Our brother Mumia, our sister Asada, our brother Herman Bell, and so many more are behind bars because of the vision that they espoused. So we have to ask ourselves, why is the state so afraid of them? The simple answer is that the state is afraid because of the fundamental challenges that the Black liberation movement posed to the ongoing conditions of poverty and racism and patriarchy and privatization and on and on and on. So our fight must also be to free all political prisoners. It's important that we don't reduce this fight merely to class warfare, because austerity is also a race war. As leftists, as people who care about the future of humanity, our core task is to build this movement But bigger than that, our task is to build a left. And I hate to break it to us, but we cannot replace building actual political power, economic power, social power with slogans and newsletters. A people's movement is emerging, but is it doing so with the presence of an organized, consolidated, multi-issue, multi-tendency left that is rooted in the working class, rooted in Black communities, rooted in the very people who have nothing to lose but everything to gain? But with that, there are people who are leftists who are leading this fight. And so it's important for us to ask ourselves in closing, the real kind of closing, not the reverend closing. What are we willing to risk? Are we willing to risk everything to get closest to what we long for the most? We can't get free unless we move with rigor and vigor towards what we long for, and we can't get free unless we're willing to risk it all for the sake of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, excuse me, is Glen Ford. The bio I've been given for him, and this is probably the bio he submitted, is way too short for someone who's accomplished so much, but here it is. Glen is executive editor of Black Agenda Report and Black Agenda Radio. He founded the Black Commentator, which he left to found Black Agenda Report with Bruce Dixon and Margaret Kimberly. BAR provides news, commentary, and analysis from a Black left perspective. If you want to get a better idea of the fullness of Glen's biography, I urge you to go to The Real News and watch the series of interviews we did with him. It's completely fascinating, as I'm sure he is about to be. Glen.
Thanks, Paul. Good evening. Good evening. Power to the people.
Power to the people.
I'm what people used to call an old head. How quickly one becomes an old head. But in the last 3 years, and most dramatically in the last 10 months, this old head has been moved to be overcome almost with joy, to have lived to see the rebirth of a militant Black movement that dares to take on the state. To take on the state in the form of the police. I'm not talking about the state of Mississippi or the state of Georgia, and it's not just in my city or in your city. It's taking on the cops everywhere that they occupy Black communities. And it's also about Black cops and Black police chiefs and Black mayors too. So many beautiful young people, young Black people and young non-Black people, have defied the personification of the state, the Black corporate Democratic president, which makes this old head very, very happy. One of my most vivid, special memories was watching the split screen on television, I think it was PBS, on the evening that the St. Louis prosecutor announced that there was not going to be any indictment of the cop that killed Michael Brown in Ferguson. On one side of the television screen was President Obama, and he was droning on and on about respect for the rule of law and other such nonsense. On the other side of the screen was a scene from Ferguson, and there were young Black people milling about. And then you saw the flickering of flames on the Ferguson side of the screen. And that was the answer to the county prosecutor, and that was the answer to the President of the United States. And that was a profound political statement by people in the street, that the police could no longer count on having a monopoly on the use of force. A monopoly of force that they had used and abused for 2 generations to build a mass black incarceration state whose mission is to throw millions of black people in prison and to contain and terrorize black communities and to criminalize an entire people. Michelle Alexander calls that the new Jim Crow. I call it the mass black incarceration state because in many ways it defines black people's relationship to the state and their relationship to the larger society. It also warps relationships between and among black people with crippling effects on black social cohesion and therefore on black political activity as well. This is the fight that had to be waged, a battle against the state itself in the form of its armed enforcers of people destroying national policy. In the wake of the Ferguson police response to the protests against the killing of Michael Brown last summer, corporate media started talking about the problem and describing it as a problem of the militarization of police. And by militarization, they meant the clothing that the cops wore, and the gear and the weapons that they carried, and the armored vehicles that they rode around in. As if you dressed the police differently and hid away their automatic weapons and their tanks, if you made them look less like soldiers, the problem would be solved and we'd have a nice, good police force. But militarization is not just about equipments, and it's not about uniforms. It is most profoundly about the mission of the police. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense back in 1966 described the police as an army of occupation in the black community. That was 3 years before the establishment of the first SWAT team. The cops didn't look like soldiers then, but they did act, they did behave, they did function as an occupation army in the black community. That was their mission. Their mission was to terrorize, suppress, and contain black people. The cops carry out that mission very well, and they do so without tanks and without automatic weapons. Very few black people are killed by cops who shoot automatic rifles from the tops of tanks. Most of the killings are done the old-fashioned way, with cops in regular uniforms firing pistols. The local police mission became a national policy with the passage of a so-called Crime Act in 1968. And that created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, called the LEAA. The LEAA pumped billions of dollars into expanding and arming and training the local police departments. By the way, that bill was signed by LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. The expanded federal role in local policing and the war on drugs, of course, laid the foundation for the national policy, not local, but national policy of mass black incarceration, which dates roughly to about 1970. That's when you see the incarceration rates going through the roof. The mass black incarceration regime was the United States government's response to the black liberation movements of the 60s. And today's emerging movement is black people's response to the mass black incarceration state. Now, at yesterday's plenary, I heard people talking a great deal about democracy and the value of democracy. Well, this is a struggle for democracy. And democracy cannot exist in communities that are occupied by hostile forces. When whole communities, when a whole people are systematically targeted for suppression by the state, bourgeois democracy is not the answer. What is needed is self-determination for those people who have been targeted. The police must be subordinated to, answerable to, and chosen by the black communities that they serve. That means black community control of the police. This system, the one that we have now, that was put in motion about 45 years ago, is not reformable. It has been very successful in its mission, so successful that 1 out of every 8 prison inmates on planet Earth is an African American. There are more people of color in prison in the United States than the entire prison population of China, which has 4.5 times as many people as the United States. So we see that by the numbers, by the metrics, the U.S. is by far the biggest police state in the world. By those same numbers, it is manifest that racial repression is the organizing principle, the central mission of the U.S. criminal justice system. That's why it is not reformable. The Black Misleadership class, and you know we at Black Agenda Report like to talk about the Black Misleadership class. That is a cohort that came into full flower about 1970. That's coterminous with the creation of the national black mass incarceration regime. They have been willing cogs in the racist machinery, and they have collaborated fully with the mass black incarceration state. Black-led cities have contributed more than their share of their constituents to the gulag. Half of the Congressional Black Caucus back in 1986 voted in favor of these 100-to-1 penalties for crack cocaine. And they have gotten even worse over time, especially under the first black president. Last June, when the Grayson Amendment to halt the Pentagon's transfers of military gear to local police departments, last year when it was up for a vote, of the 40 black voting congresspersons, 32 either voted against the Grayson Amendment or abstained. What that means is that 80% of the Congressional Black Caucus, 4 out of 5 of them, supported the militarization of the police, including the black congressman who represents Ferguson, Missouri. So this generation of activists is in a confrontation with not only the U.S. state in the form of the police, but also with the black misleadership class, which wants nothing but to prove its usefulness to the people who rule America. Elements of this movement have already clashed repeatedly with these misleaders in Ferguson and in Baltimore and in places across the country. I believe that the most important breakthrough so far that this young movement has made is its readiness to take on the black misleadership class, who act as surrogates for the oppressor. And finally, if this movement succeeds in creating a crisis of governance, which it must do, then it will be treated as insurgent by the counterinsurgency apparatus. And when you get treated as an insurgent by that apparatus, there will come long-term political prisoners. And yet, we have not yet freed all of our political prisoners from the last movement of more than 40 years ago. So this new movement must prioritize our prisoners, our past prisoners, and our prisoners to come. Free all political prisoners. Because there's going to be a lot more of them. Power to the people.
Thank you, Glenn. Our next speaker is Thenjiwe McHarris. Thenjiwe is a Human Rights at Home campaign director with the U.S. Human Rights Network, has spent her entire political and professional career challenging the injustice that imprison people in their communities in a life of poverty or one behind bars. She's also worked on a number of campaigns, including those that address state repression around the world, the transfer of military equipment and technology, capital punishment, excessive use of force by law enforcement, and poverty. McHarris began her political career calling for an end to policies and practices that contributed to acts of torture committed by law enforcement, and currently helps to coordinate efforts to hold the U.S. government accountable for violating international human rights law. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. So I'm a call and response girl. Good evening. Good evening. So first I want to thank the Left Forum. I also, like Alicia, want to acknowledge that we are in the company of some very powerful people, Uncle Bobby, Uncle Ron, Michael Brown Sr. that just left. They are walking reminders of why the fight for freedom is essential, why conversations like this are necessary, and why you must call into question which side are you on. So I want to start this conversation putting into context policing. Before even talking about policing, it's important for us to reject this notion, this idea of bad apples. This idea that if we have better practices, we could change policing in this country. Policing, the purpose of policing is to control black bodies. The purpose of policing in this country is to control poor people. The purpose of policing in the United States is to protect the interests of the wealthy and protect their property. So it is essential for us to not just talk about reforming policing in the United States, but to challenge the legitimacy, challenge the existence of policing in the United States. Killing black people in the United States is an American tradition. Caging black people in the United States is American tradition. We must call out. So before I even say that, we have to not be afraid to name what's happening to us. We lose the moment. We do not seize on the courage to name what is happening to us, what is happening to our people, and why. We must have the courage to say what is happening to black people, to poor people, but we must also have the courage to call out what's happening to our brothers and sisters around the world. There is a direct connection to drone strikes in Pakistan, to Guantanamo Bay, to the killing of people in Afghanistan, to the killing of black people, of brown people in the United States of America. We do not win unless we build a united global movement that has the power and the courage to confront power, to confront an entity, a system that is dedicated, that is committed to controlling wealth, that is committed to keeping power that it has. We only win if we decide which side are we on. If we decide to demand no less than what is deserved of us. If we decide that it's actually not what you should give me, it is mine already. Human rights is something you are born with. The right to education, the right to employment, the right to health care, the right to not be tracked down, harassed, targeted, killed in the middle of the street is your fundamental human right. The moment we decide, whether you're in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, New York City, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Guatemala, the moment we decide around the world that these are our rights, this is not something you are going to give to me, this is something I am going to take. How y'all feeling? You sure? So there was a question that I was asked to answer, which is the struggle going away? The truth is, historically before us, our people, oppressed people, have always resisted, and we will continue to resist. So the right question is, what does it mean to win? What must we do to win? And the first thing is we have to believe in the possibility that we will. We do this work every day. We organize and we resist, and we doubt. We doubt. And because we doubt, we don't call what it is, what it actually is, and we don't demand what we need in order to see our people free, in order to walk our way towards liberation. We have to make a decision to believe in the possibility of winning. Once you believe in it, once people around you believe in it, we become that much closer to seeing our people free, but more importantly, to seeing a world where our children don't have to be the ones that we bury. That's right. Ayanna, that's right. Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, Rekia Boyd. Rekia Boyd was shot in the head. We have to ask ourselves, how many more? When will we decide that enough is enough? We are at a moment in the history of not just black people, but the history of this country, where we are seeing young, black, working class people putting their bodies on the line for freedom, for truth, confronting power. We must decide which side we are on. And so I ask you, as you come here and you listen to speeches, you take notes, you organize with people, what are you willing to do to change this country, to change the world? Because until you make that decision, we will continue to see the blood of our children on the street corners of every city, of every town across this country. Now I'm going to ask you, which side are you on? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a special pleasure to introduce a fellow Baltimorean, which is what I am now, Makayla Gilliam-Price. Makayla is a 17-year-old Baltimore activist. She founded the youth justice organization City Block, also organizes with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a youth-led grassroots think tank which advances the public policy in the interests of black people in Baltimore. She's a rising senior at Baltimore City College High School. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. So coming to this part of the forum, I imagine myself speaking on something, I imagine myself speaking on a very different topic. I thought I'd be running down a few of a few of the accomplishments of the block, expressing our next steps, where we've been, and sharing a bit of why we have to get involved in this movement to affirm black lives. However, while observing some of the panels here and hearing from amazing speakers about their brave stories and listening to the responses of engaged audiences, I was driven to speak on something a little bit different, but still extremely crucial to the understanding of how to properly and effectively take part in the movement that has been brewing in this country for centuries. Something that happens daily in Baltimore City Public Schools, and from what I have heard from my peers across the country in their schools as well, is that schools are filled with Black children, and therefore Black potential and Black futures, and arguably most importantly, but most neglected, is the fact that these schools are filled with Black histories, right? So, what we see a lot of is that in these schools, is Black children being taught that their histories by white teachers via their own biases and through the work of white scholars. Our histories are treated like a disease better off forgotten, therefore our Black lives are pathologized, and therefore our futures are non-existent. We have Black professors who are called progressives, who truly believe that Black scholarship only began at the Bill of Sale when we stepped off of slave ships, but never acknowledged anything before that. Our children are not being taught the ideals of Sankofa, and we are footnotes in European history. And what's interesting is that we all know this to be true. What I say thus far is not novel, and quite honestly is talked about entirely too much, and nothing is done about it. But then you come to this amazingly inspiring forum called the Left Forum, and immediately the same exact memories and experiences of never learning truly your history are triggered. Even the name of this conference sparked something in me that seemed potentially problematic. A quote from my mentor, Davon Love, from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, always says to me, a quote by John Henrik Clarke, seems amazingly relevant at this point in time, which is, the left and the right have us wrong. The fact that this whole notion of what is left and what is right is derived from European intellectual traditions, where, much like some of the things I saw here, was simply a lot of white scholars, fresh from the ivory tower, arguing over white solutions to Black problems. Therefore, what is usually referred to as the left, in the words of Harold Cruz in the book that I'm reading currently, is really a white social world colored and infused with the implicit assumptions of that ethnic group. And all that's happening is that we continue to frame out Black scholarship, and we delegitimize the Black people who are of and from these disposable populations that we are trying so desperately to help, AKA we are ignoring those who are the only ones who know the needs and therefore the solutions for Black people. We are ignoring Black history, Black children, Black queer lives. We are ignoring Black women. We are ignoring Black disabled communities. We are ignoring the impoverished Black communities. To put it simply, we are ignoring the hashtag Black Lives Matter that is plastered all over your Twitter. And then you find that because you have been ignoring all of these populations, that you are solving issues that do not exist or solving in ways that are inevitably destructive. And then, if that's not problematic enough, I see myself and my brothers and my sisters becoming victims of a sort of negrophilia, a fetishization of our Black bodies and our Black struggle. We are being made into pets for those white allies who need someone to soothe their white guilt. We see Black people being tokenized and wrapped up into the NPOs and the grassroots of all of these white allies, but who are only allowed to engage in politics in the ways that those whites allow. And if you haven't already seen this, this is already becoming a cycle. And for what purpose? For whites to obscure their guilt with rootless class discussions, and for whites to, on a very fundamental level, control the narrative of Black progress and politics. So all of this is to say simply that if we truly want to see change from this movement, then we need to listen to those who are from the communities who are struggling, listen to the young Black queer women, and then it's not enough to just listen, but to act, not for, not on the behalf, but with us. Stop making careers out of my struggle. Yeah. We need to engage. We need to stop engaging in the problematic spaces of the left and then critiquing the right as if both of the ends of the spectrum do not make racism and white supremacy even more insidious and hard to pin down and combat. We need to let the black lives, the black babies, the black history, the black sexuality, the black rage, the black futures that we continue to say matter, speak.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kshama Sawant. Kshama is an activist who brings a passion for social justice to her work as a member of the Seattle City Council. She's been a voice for workers, youth, and the oppressed. After earning her PhD in economics, Kshama has moved to Seattle and began teaching at Seattle Central Community College, Seattle University, and the University of Washington, Tacoma. She joined the Socialist Alternative in 2009, and since then has helped organize demonstrations for marriage equality, participated in the movement to end wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was a leading presence in the Occupy movement. In November 2013, she defeated a 16-year incumbent Democrat to become the first socialist elected in a major U.S. city in decades. And is the only council member in Seattle outside the Democratic Party establishment. Kshama has consistently used her position to expose the ties between powerful corporate interests and a majority of the city's politicians, all Democrats. After being at the forefront of the movement that won a 15-hour minimum wage, Kshama helped win critical funding for homeless people in the city budget last year, and she's up for re-election this year. Thanks very much for joining us, Kshama.
My dear sisters, brothers, comrades, thank you for being here this evening. I want to start by saying what a privilege it is to be speaking alongside such esteemed fellow panelists. And I also want to start by paying my respects to everybody, not just today, but in the past, who has waged a courageous battle against racism, institutionalized racism, and against capitalism. I think it's important to recognize the wider context that has given rise to this wave of struggle, which is the deep crisis of global capitalism, which has accelerated the massive growth of inequality and economic insecurity. Just to give you one of many stunning facts, from a recent Federal Reserve study on the financial well-being of Americans, we see 47% in the wealthiest country in the history of humanity say that they would not have the resources to meet an unexpected expense of $400. They would have to sell something or borrow to meet that need if they could meet it at all. And these statistics are even more stark and heartbreaking when we look at what's happened to the Black community. The biggest loss of wealth has been for Black people since the recession, since the economic recession, and it has also been the biggest loss of wealth since slavery. This is the system we're living in, where 40% of the children of color in the United States are living in deep poverty. And in all of this, in all of these economic statistics are embedded the absolutely outrageous facts of what life is, what day-to-day life is like for Black people, for the people of color. Living in decades of brutalization, the war, the systematic war on Black people, the demonizing of Black people, and the demonizing of poor people. This is the context in which this struggle is starting to emerge. And we've seen these waves of struggle begin in more prominent way through the public sector uprising in Wisconsin in 2011, which started against Scott Walker's attacks on union rights and the vicious austerity agenda, which the Democratic Party establishment did not help fight against. And this wave of struggle went on to express itself through the Occupy movement and the environmental movement, the massive People's Climate March in New York City last September. And it is right now being expressed through this enormously courageous and militant Black Lives Matter movement. And I think there is nothing more clarifying than the Black Lives Matter movement to show us who are the agents of social change, who are the agents of a fight back against a brutal social and economic agenda. It is not the Democratic Party establishment. It is not the black misleaders that Glenn correctly talked about. It is the young people, the young black people, young people of color, who not only have put out a clarion call for a militant struggle, but they have boldly rejected these ossified layers of the so-called leadership. It was the family of Akai Gurley who told Sharpton to go home and that did not want his traveling circus. And it was the sustained and determined revolt of people, especially young people, that has finally led to a small but significant victory where in Baltimore, 6 police officers have been indicted, have been arrested. And I think that the questions we face are not only the question of whether or not this is inspiring, because there is no question that this is inspiring. There is no question that this is critical. But the question that we face, that faces all of us in society, this is not just the obligation or the responsibility of the black community. This is our collective responsibility, as Alicia and other speakers have so clearly and eloquently enunciated. Our question, the question to our society is, how are we going to defeat institutional racism, which itself is ultimately the legacy of slavery, the legacy of imperialism, and the legacy of capitalism? How will we wage a successful war against police brutality, against mass incarceration, against the dehumanization and virtual extinguishing of black lives and black spirit, and the spirits of poor people, the spirits of all people of color? How will we fight against the social depression, the deep, deep underlying social deprivation that has blighted so many of our communities? How will we wage a fight for, as Alicia said, for dignity and self-determination? How are we going to do this? Because the struggle for black liberation is a question that is facing, as I said, not just black people, but all of us, all of the broader layers of the working class. Because unless defeating structural and institutional racism and absolutely ending it off the face of this earth, unless this is an integral part of the agenda of a broader movement of working people and the oppressed, we have no hope of winning any kind of fundamental social change away from capitalism. And unless we do that, and unless we actually embrace that as part of our struggle, as integral to our struggle against capitalism, the structures of racism themselves will remain intact, because unless we defeat capitalism, racism will not be defeated. Because as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And therefore, I join my sisters and brothers on the panel in making the call that the struggle for black liberation has to be all of our struggle. it's also important for us to begin the conversation to concretely lay out a program of action for ourselves, not only for this year, but in the near future. Because unless we channel this massive and righteous outrage and anger that we all feel, unless we channel that into organized, collective struggle that can ultimately win victories, concrete victories against the system in the teeth of massive opposition from the ruling class, we're not going to be able to hold on to this moment for very long. There is an incredible historic moment right now, and it is our obligation as the left to seize on it. But how can we do it? I think we need to build the Black liberation movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, into a cohesive national movement that takes on concrete political demands and empowers and indeed demands that the broader layers of the working class join us in this movement. I think one of the most important steps that are upcoming for us is the National Conference of the Black Lives Matter movement in Cleveland, Ohio on July 24th to 26th. Our movement needs to use this conference and many such other national meetings to call for concrete political demands with the idea of raising the banner of a larger struggle, an organized collective struggle. And what demands might they be? Some of them have already been elucidated. The community control of police by democratically elected bodies is absolutely critical and central. And we have to be clear, this is not a symbolic demand. This needs to be an actual demand where we say that these democratically elected bodies of our community that have our people, Black people on it, will have full powers over the police for hiring, firing, subpoenaing, to judicial inquiries, and the budget of the police departments. Our movement needs to call to tax the super wealthy and big corporations to not only fully fund public education, but specifically target the systematic racism in our public school system and wage a war against the betrayal of the Democratic Party that, just as an example, through Rahm Emanuel, has carried out a decimation of our Black community in Chicago. We need to call, as others have said, for an immediate release of all political prisoners, but also an immediate release of those incarcerated, those hundreds of thousands incarcerated on nonviolent drug charges. We need to call for an attack on the military budget to fund youth job programs and living wage unionized jobs for all working people. But my sisters, brothers, we also need to take this struggle that we are building on the streets, in the workplaces, this endeavor to build mass movements, we need to take this into the political space as well. Because as long as we, who are building a struggle against capitalism, as long as we cede the halls of power, whether it's in the City Hall of Seattle or in US Congress or in the White House, as long as we cede those halls of power to those very people who have carried out this oppression of us, we are not going to win. That's right. And that is why our struggle to build mass movements has to be joined by a very clear call for an independent political alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. And we need to make it clear what kind of political formation we are talking about. We don't want a party that is independent in name and ends up funneling to the very parties that are carrying out our oppression. We want working people, poor people, oppressed people, black people, and people of color to be at the leadership of this call to build a new political party. And we want this party to be rooted in the mass movements that we're building. And we want the party to legitimize the leaders who have already proven their selflessness in fighting for the movement. We want this political formation to not only take on the demands that are intricately tied to the question of the brutality against black people, but also, as others have said, tie it to all the social and economic demands that we know are completely tied to why black people experience police brutality. It's not in a vacuum of society. It's happening in the context of the systematic impoverishment of black people. So these demands have to be taken up. But at the end of the day, my sisters and brothers, unless we take on the serious call to be truly independent of the establishment parties, and let me say again, truly independent of the Democratic Party, we will not succeed. And just to clarify, I don't repeat Republican as much as Democrat because I assume everybody's clear about the role of the Republican Party. The confusion in many people's minds lies in the role of the Democratic Party. And I wanted to, as my last piece, to share with you something I hope some of you already know, but to lay out some of the general points that I feel come up from our historic success in Seattle. When Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of social and economic justice activists, when we launched our campaign for city council in 2013, we were very much rooted in the movement. I personally came out of the Occupy Seattle movement, and we laid out a campaign program, a campaign manifesto, once again, that took its lead from young workers, many of them young black workers, who walked out right here in Manhattan in November 2012, calling for 15 and a union. And we threw out all the conventional rules that we were told that grassroots movements and grassroots campaigns have to follow. They told us, be timid. We were audacious. They told us, don't say you're a socialist. We said we're socialists at every step of the way. They said, don't raise the banner of racial injustice so high, you're going to alienate other working people. We raised the banner of racial justice so high, and we confirmed our suspicions, which is that the broader layers of the working class are completely in solidarity on the demands for racial justice. We were told we have to take money from anybody who's willing to fund our campaign. We declared we are an anti-corporate, pro-working people's campaign that will not take a penny from big business. And all this, my friends, is not to make a simplistic claim that every campaign that we run is going to look identical, or that we would even win in every campaign that we run. But it is to illustrate that our victory, the victories on $15 an hour nationwide, and the emergence of a militant black struggle rooted in young people's movement, all of these collectively are indications of this historic moment that we're in that will pass if we don't seize on it immediately. And I also wanted to illustrate what we can do if we win power at every level. Just to give you an example of what's happening in Seattle. Coincidentally, with the emergence of the BLM movement, we've also seen an attack by the Seattle establishment on young black people through a campaign to build a new youth jail, to spend $210 million building a youth jail. We tied our city council voice very closely, completely to the Black Lives Matter movement in Seattle, which has been waging a valiant struggle against the youth jail. And it will come as no surprise, hopefully, to all of you here, that even though the entire city council, as Paul said, other than me, is Democratic Party, I was the only vote against the youth jail. And this should be a reminder, a sober reminder for us that we have no hope, once again, unless we build independent struggles. And we are also in a city in Seattle where the police department is under a consent decree by the Department of Justice for systematic excessive use of force and systematic racial targeting. We are fighting against that. I was the only no vote against the appointment of the police chief, the new police chief, who is, for appearances, somewhat different, but as events have borne us out, is part of the same establishment. I offer these examples with an appeal to everybody, not just in this room, but out there, who want to build a struggle, who are looking for a way forward, that we can build an enormous fighting movement, not just in the United States, but globally. As Thenjiwe correctly said, this has to be a global struggle. We can do this, but for that, it will require us to carry out a principled leadership where we are clear that the establishment, no matter whether they're D or R, are stacked against us. They represent the ruling class, we represent the working class and the poor, and that our interests are fundamentally, diametrically opposed to each other, and there is no meeting ground, and that we have to build an independent struggle. Solidarity.
Oh, don't leave. Oh, no. The fireworks are about to begin. Okay, if you really have to go to the restroom that badly. There's something kind of obvious here that comes out of partly what Makayla was saying. The left forum has to be about, 95% also the white forum. I know one of the things that the organizers have hoped to do this year is to make the forum more relevant to those people who are in the forefront of struggle right now. But what is going to be the relationship of the black and white left? It's been a serious question all through the 1960s and the civil rights movement. I mean, one of the whole objectives of the ideology of white supremacy is to divide people. You know, for white workers to think they're better than black workers, even though in many cases they're, I can't say as oppressed, but they are very oppressed. So this issue of how to have unity and the relationship of the white working class movement, white progressives, and the black liberation movement and the movement for self-determination, and some of the comments Michaela raised, I'm wondering if you could all address this, maybe starting with Alicia, and then we can kind of go down the row. Let me just say, Michaela said work with us. Well, what does that look like? What is that?
Can we start at the other end?
What's that? Say that again? Excuse me, I've been asked to ask you to please be quiet. Was that assertive enough or authoritative enough? I can get bossier if you want me to.
Is this thing on? How's that? Okay. You know, at the risk of sounding a little bit controversial, I would say that, quite frankly, I think what's being called out, what's being lifted up here, is that black folks need to be a part of this conversation and at the center of it. And so the question of how to kind of bring together a white left and a black left, I feel like we need to build a left. I feel like black folks need to be able to have space to figure out what is our program, what is our vision, what are our demands, and then we need to be able to coalesce. But if it's a question of how do we make spaces like this more inclusive, I think what I want to say is it's really a question of where are black folks organized, and how do black folks then help shape forums like this, right? So it's not just a question of, are we recruiting black people to show up? But the question is, how can this be useful to the pursuit of black liberation? Those are different things. I think the last thing that I just want to kind of lift up is also the importance of spaces for black folks to figure out stuff for our family. So I want to just kind of lift up, for example, the gathering that's happening in Cleveland is a gathering for black folks who have been in motion to come together as an emerging movement to meet each other, get to know each other, strategize together, exchange tactics, exchange skills, exchange tools, educate one another, love on one another, right? So I think that's an important space to hold, quite frankly. And I think that we need to continue to support things like that.
If I can go after Alicia every panel I'm on, I'd come to more of these. So it's a really important question, and I'm happy you asked it. And so two things come to mind. In order to address the issue that is present within the left forum, the left has to grapple with racism within the left. The left has to acknowledge the ways in which white supremacy operates within the left. And then the second is respecting black leadership. It's not just a thing you say, but something you actively do. And the truth is, if you have not asked yourself, how am I respecting black leadership, then guess what? You probably don't respect black leadership. And so the truth is, I believe we need a united front in this country and around the world, but that does not happen unless white supremacy is not just acknowledged, addressed, confronted, but eradicated in the left. And it also does not happen if black leadership is not respected, acknowledged, and allowed to be where a lot of us have already been, which is leading in the front.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right. Okay. So I don't want to be like pinned down as someone who does not believe in a coalition of movements at all, and I don't want my arguments. You can't hear me. Okay. I don't want to be pinned down as someone who does not believe in the coalition of movements, and I also don't want my arguments to be conflated to that. But I completely agree with what was just said, that we need to start with unveiling the things that have been obscured by white supremacy and racism and anti-blackness, starting with things like black history, respecting black leadership, black scholarship. We need to move away from delegitimizing those who have the power and the voices to fix all of the problems that we are trying to solve. And I am full-heartedly a believer in the fact that we need to begin with solving for the most oppressed body, right? So just imagine, right? I think this makes sense. If we start with a black, queer, disabled, poor woman, right? We're inevitably solving for all of the other oppressions that are included within that intersectional body, right? So it's not that I'm saying that class does not have a place in this movement, but I'm saying that the permutation in the way that we go about solving for all of these different intersectional oppressions is that we need to start by seeing what the true root cause is, right? And I think it's really problematic that we get into these root cause debates, because I don't think that's where the answer lies. It's where we need to start looking at where all of these problems fall into one place, right? And I don't think that's a hard thing to do. And when we start listening to the people who represent that population where all of these problems are embodied, then I think we have a very easy solution, right? But that also comes with giving up some of your white privilege. That also comes with listening to those bodies. That comes with acknowledging what they're saying and not just listening, but then acting with them and how they say is most important and significant and effective, the most effective way to act with them. And I think that once we do that, then we'll have a much more productive movement. And then we also need to start questioning the sincerity of the leaders. I see a lot of white allies who come to forums like these and who are looking for sympathy or for a pat on the back. So if this could just be a charge to the white allies in this room to stop looking for that, and to truly start being about the movement and the people who are of and from the communities who are suffering the most.
I'd like to start off by pointing something really fundamental out. Although we have the obligation to talk about the crimes of the U.S. criminal justice system against black people, and to point out that its mission to suppress and terrorize black folks is the guiding principle of that system. It is also true that in creating this huge net, these draconian laws, the biggest gulag in the world, what this had led to is that white Americans go to prison in much higher numbers than people in Europe or other industrialized countries. So white Americans have an immediate interest in the dismantlement of this system, because they wind up as collateral damage, getting sucked into this machine that's designed to suck us up, but it can't help it. It sucks up the white fish as well. And it's difficult to calibrate that kind of system. And although they've created diversion programs, you know what those are, to try to divert people from actually having to go to prison, those are made for diverting white people from prison. That can't take care of the vast numbers of them either. So there is a fundamental interest among white folks of all political persuasions to tear down this police state. In terms of opposition to this police state, as I said, it is by the numbers, by far the biggest in the world. We should have a common cause with everyone who has a problem with this, not just national security state and what it does in this country, but all over the world. The United States is wiring everybody. I don't know why they want to listen to everybody's phone in Spain, but they do, which in fact is a reason for people in Spain to have common cause with us. But you know, it's important to point out that the black mass incarceration begins with hyper surveillance. That's where it starts. If you want to find crime, well, you look for it. And if you can't find it, then you make it up. But that's where it starts. So there's nobody in this country who has more of a stake in fighting surveillance and the national security state, way beyond just cops on foot patrol, than black folks do. If we're talking about opposition to capitalism and U.S. imperialism, well, of course, we have allies all over the world who we should work with in solidarity all the time, because capitalism and U.S. imperialism are the common enemies of humanity.
Do you want to add something? Or? So I wanted to start first by joining my voice to with all those who have on the panel who've talked about how it is absolutely essential that black people and people of color and all the oppressed themselves be at the leadership and at the center of any movement that we create, not just as not as props, not as props, but because we're not going to win these victories unless we have the oppressed leading the movement itself. That is something that is organic to movements. And I also agree that we have to grapple with racism amongst ourselves, amongst the left, in the labor movement. In every organized struggle, we will have to do that. Just as we have in the past grappled with, and also actually as we still do, grapple with sexism and misogyny within the labor movement and within organized struggle. It's not something that automatically goes away. These are behaviors that we all who are oppressed end up learning. Children are not born with racist ideas. These are given to them, these are beaten into their heads by a brutal system that ends up brutalizing even those purveyors of racism among the working class. And so we have to actively challenge that. And we have done that before. The question is, how do we do it? What approach can we take in order to actually make sure that we are fighting against oppression within our own layers, within our own ranks, while we are fighting a larger unified struggle against the system that oppresses all of us? And obviously, I mean, I don't have like formulas, but just to give you some examples of how this process unfolds, something that comes to mind to me is a little scene that I remember from Democracy Now!'s coverage of the Egyptian revolution, in 2011. I remember, the camera went and talked to a lot of just ordinary people, young people who had never been part of a political struggle before, but here they were leading a revolutionary struggle against Mubarak and his regime. And one of the women was asked, what stands out to you in your own personal experience of this movement? And she said, and it never goes away from me because, I'm also an immigrant woman of color. I have experienced, we all have experienced sexism, sexual, harassment to some degree. I think we all have experienced that. And so it really spoke to me. What she said was that one of the things that struck her in a deep way was that in the movement, in the protest marches and in the movement that they were building on the streets, not just in Tahrir Square, but all across the cities, many cities in Egypt, many women were surrounded by oceans of men. And a lot of colonized countries have had the legacy of extreme sexism and sexual violence, and Egypt is not alone in that. But what she said was that because we were unified in this struggle, and because everybody had a sense of empowerment and a solidarity, that the person walking next to me is not a woman that I can harass, but is a partner in the struggle, she said, for the first time in an ocean of men, she felt safe as a woman in Egypt. And I don't say that to be simplistic, but I say that for us to understand the way we can stamp out these oppressions amongst us as we fight against larger oppression would not be to alienate people or to denounce them. While we have to fight, of course, we have to fight for it, but to engage in a deeper conversation where we all, women, black people, all the oppressed can build our power and challenge these isms that exist amongst ourselves. And I should also point out that this is nothing new. These are not, the ideas of labor struggle and organized struggle. These are not European ideas. These are ideas of the oppressed everywhere. There's nothing unique about it. If we look at the history of the American left and the American labor movement, who are the leaders who led these historic struggles to bring us to where we are today? Many of them, many of the leaders were immigrant people, black people, people of color. Sometimes they didn't even speak each other's language, but they spoke the language of class struggle. They were the ones who led the movement. So let us never assume that the idea of struggle or collective action is the domain of white people. This is the domain of all of us who are oppressed. And just to conclude, more recently, we have to look at positive examples. If you all recall, April 15th, which just passed by, was an enormous national day of action with tens of thousands of workers coming out, not just fighting for 15, but with a larger agenda of social change. And we have to look at how SEIU, I have lots of disagreements with organized labor myself, but they made the link between the fight for a living wage to the fight for racial justice. That's the sort of example we need, where we connect the two and do not allow the ruling class to divide us.
If I follow my orders, this session's over in 15 minutes. My next question is going to take more than 15 minutes, I think. I don't know. Can we go a little longer? Would people like us to go a little longer? All right. Well, that ain't the format. So I asked a young activist in Baltimore what question I should ask. And his question was, we've seen a rise in the mass movement before, and it's dissipated. How do we sustain this? One of my colleagues at The Real News, who grew up in Baltimore in a hood, she was out covering the initial fight between the young people and the cops, and she talked about how liberating it was to be able to throw rocks at cops, because it's always they have the power. But I've talked to some leading activists from Ferguson, and they say you can't sustain a movement just based on confronting cops in the streets. It ignites people. It does give a sense of empowerment to people, but you can only do it for so long. Like, what's the second act? So the issue of sustainability, what comes next, the issue of the relationship of elections, electoral strategy, to building a movement. If you could each take a go at that. Again, let's start with Alicia.
Can we start in somewhere else?
Yeah, sure. Well, who wants to go first? Anybody want to? Well, Makayla's grabbing the mic.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I am a strong believer in the multifaceted approach, right? And of course, still can't hear me. All right. Is this good?
There you go. Rock that
Maybe.
mic like an MC. Work it.
Just keep it right up against you.
Okay. So I'm a strong believer in the multifaceted approach, right? And of course, throwing rocks at police officers is never going to be the only solution. But I don't think that we can just devalue those solutions and devalue the black rage that happened in Baltimore when children and high schoolers were throwing rocks at the police. And I think it's very important that we take into account the fact that I represent a very different demographic, right? 75% of the kids that I represent are not able to vote yet. So we cannot take part in the electoral process like you would expect us to. And so I think it's important that we are not in promoting other solutions and other methodologies of liberation, that we are not devaluing the only facets that young people across the country have to express their political agency. But once again, the students of Baltimore have engaged in the electoral process through organizations like Leaders of the Beautiful Struggle, right? We're always fighting against the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights in Maryland, which is one of the strictest across the country. We're continuing our protests in the streets, but I think the question of how do we sustain these movements is an extremely important one, just because we see that these issues have a 6 to 9 month shelf life, right? And then in the event that the police officers do get indicted, like they were in Baltimore, we see this instilled attitude of complacency. And I think the only way to make sure that these movements are still continuing and that they're not just moments in our history, but movements, is that we continue to unveil and unravel what's happening on the daily basis. We need to stop using black deaths as symbols of these movements. We need to see that it's not just a bad police officer that we're fighting against or just one person that died that we're fighting for, but a system and a systematic type of oppression that's been plaguing our communities for centuries, right? Yeah, that's right.
Actually, Alicia and Thenjiwe have to leave at 9:45. So Alicia, why don't you go, then Thenjiwe, and then we'll say goodbye.
So, again, a very good question. Did anyone see the video of the rocks? Or young people throwing rocks? Okay. So if folks who watch the entire video, you see the officers are initially throwing rocks, and then you see this wave of young people throwing rocks. I mean, what you see is like a beautiful act of community. Like a beautiful way in which we love each other up. It's the way we have survived this entire time. And so if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch it. What's the title? You know? Baltimore Kids Throwing Rocks. Yeah, just Google Baltimore Kids Throwing Rocks. I mean, it's very powerful, it's very moving, but I mean, whether it's Kimani Gray in East Flatbush, New York, and the way the young people resisted there, or in Ferguson, Missouri, in the face of MRAPs. Do y'all know what MRAPs are? Right? Like, these are mind-resistant, armored vehicles, things that the U.S. government can't even bring to other countries because it's banned, right? So I encourage you to sort of look at these images in ways in which that you can see the beauty in the community manifesting right in front of you. And so, but the question is, how do we sustain this? Well, the first is, across the country, young people, young working class black people are creating political homes for themselves, right? Are creating ways in which they can engage in sustained long-term organizing, which is essential. What is important is to not act like we have all the answers. What is important is to realize that the only way we get to the answers is if we create the kind of political homes in which we can struggle with each other together. The second is the need for a high level of coordination across the country. We need to be able to struggle around these very important questions in a way that allows for us to really think about what it is we need in order to, not just to survive, but to thrive. And that goes to my third point. We need to create spaces to struggle around a set of transformative visionary demands. Not ones that the misleadership class or really establishment organizations create, body cameras, to allow for more surveillance of our people, more surveillance of Muslim communities, using that data that we do not get to control, but using data that they can now use to further persecute and repress our people. We must create spaces and ways for us in a process that we can engage in the kind of struggle across the country that allows for the emergence and the birth of a set of transformative, visionary national demands.
That's right, my sister. That's right. I can't overemphasize the need for more organizing. I feel like we throw that around and we say we got to organize, but we need a bigger base. We actually need to build at some level of scale, and we're not there yet. And when we talk about these different tactics, what's the relationship of electoral strategies, et cetera, all of those are about moving people towards a particular end. And I'm not sure that we're doing enough of the deep base building work that's necessary to actually win at the scale that we need to win. I think the other thing that's important, quite frankly, is, there's a policy struggle, which is an important one. There's also a cultural and a hegemonic struggle. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to play it like it's not a question of identity politics, y'all. This is actually a question of how do we shift the common sense in this country? Mm-hmm. How do we shift the common sense in this country? Because for people to vote actually in their interests, right, we need to be able to get people at different places. And the fact of the matter is, I'm not sure that we are yet there where we're seeing common cause, although there's a lot. There is a lot. And some of it is about class. But some of it is also about answering the question of how does racial oppression impact me? How does racial oppression impact me? How do I lose? How do I lose from the exploitation and the oppression of black people? And the reality is, I don't know that we've answered that question clearly, but there is something very wrong with a world, right, where folks are born to think that they're better than others. It's simple, but it's kind of profound, right? And that hurts white folks in a deep way, because you have a skewed vision of how the world actually functions. And so to that end, I would say that another place where I feel like we could dig in a little bit more is what's the state of anti-racist organizing in this country? What's the state of anti-racist organizing in this country? Not just of folks coming together as workers, because the fact of the matter is people live together in communities and people aren't working formally, right? So there's something in there that we need to dig into. There's something in there that we need to dig into, and the anti-racist organizing is definitely not at the scale that we need it to be at. There are organizations that are trying to do that, trying to dig in around how do we move and politicize and educate and organize and agitate the white working class that is continuously, right, voting against their interests. This is a lesson that we've learned before, right? Du Bois taught us this, talked to us about this during Reconstruction, how the fundamental missed opportunity was the alliance between newly freed Africans and the white working class who was also enslaved. I think we're seeing some parallels today, but the right is appealing much more clearly, not just to the white working class, but some segments of folks of color as well. And that's based on a whole bunch of things that are both about the economy, but it's also about this kind of culture of fear that fuels the mass incarceration complex. But it also fuels, right, these narratives around who's deserving, who's not deserving, what's possible, what's not possible.
Alicia and Thenjiwe have to leave, so we're going to continue. So let's say goodbye to them, and then we're going to keep going. All right, you decided to stay. You didn't stay. All right, Glenn, I'll kind of restate the question quickly. The conversation I had with these activists from Ferguson, they said this to me. This igniting factor of confronting the police and what you said, you know, that the state doesn't have a monopoly on violence, it helped spark a whole movement. But they can't sustain that. They can't go out every day and just fight with cops every day. There has to be the next thing, and that they're grappling with that in Ferguson right now. So, same question. How does this movement sustain itself?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to be very serious about what we mean when we say no justice, no peace. That means that our mission is to build the capability to enforce that threat. The other aspect is that it's not entirely in our hands. We don't decide whether we're going to throw rocks or have a demonstration out of thin air. It's prompted by the police and the atrocities that they hand down with regularity. And they can be expected to deliver the same kinds of atrocities, and we must respond. So it's not like this is an elective. You know, there is no other choice. What we need, the capability that we need to be building is the ability.
Yeah, you got to really speak right into the mic.
Yeah, how about this? The capability we need to be building is the ability to create a crisis for the people in power. We live in a state of crisis. The whole point is to make that crisis general, to create different circumstances so that the people with power will force to respond in a way that before the crisis they would never have considered responding. And so how do we exact the price? I believe that we are going to have to at least have the credible threat of making cities ungovernable. And there is a price. The people who rule the country do pay a price for an ungovernable or a threatened ungovernable city. There's an economic price that is vast, but there's one that you can't put a dollar sign on, and that is the price of the loss of legitimacy. We can do that. We can strip them of their legitimacy. And I think that is more powerful than exacting a couple of $1 million because a sports event is canceled because they're afraid of us. It really doesn't matter. You know, Dr. King's philosophy in terms of direct action was to bring the crisis to a head, to make the crisis general. And it doesn't really matter if that is achieved through the anonymous actions of folks who throw rocks and run, or it's achieved by a mass, disciplined, quite public action. The reality is it's going to be both. That's the way it really goes down. But the creation of the crisis, the exact opposite of bringing calm, that's our goal.
Last word, Jim.
So I agree with a lot of the points that were made and also what Glenn said, so I won't repeat, I'll try not to repeat them. But I think when we ask ourselves the important question, how do we sustain this movement, I think to some degree history can be a guide. And what we see if we look back and we see in heightened periods of struggle when actual victories were won, a lot of that shows us that movements do not necessarily develop in a straight line through some sort of formula. So it is absolutely correct and just absolutely exciting that we have the emergence of a Black Lives Matter movement, emergence of a movement of low-wage workers and people who are fighting against economic injustice. But we don't have a textbook version of what's going to happen next. Some of it is going to happen because that's what a mass of people want to happen. You or I won't be able to control it. So I think the fundamental step that we need to take is, in terms of building a cohesive movement, is to link up the Black liberation movement to larger movements around other political, economic, and social demands, and keep the flame alive of the question of racism itself, defeating racism itself, because it is through that process that it will be defeated. Just to give you one concrete example, in the 60s and 70s, when there were women's rights movement, Black rights movements, Native American rights movement, anti-war movement, all of these movements were emerging. The point at which they became a real threat to the US ruling class was when they started coalescing and building upon each other and not really, trying to sort of artificially determine that, first we have to win, the reproductive rights for women, then we're going to defeat the war against, end the war in Vietnam and so on. It's not that way that movements develop. Movements take on an energy of themselves, and our duty is to be there in solidarity with whatever movement is emerging without ever trivializing or minimizing the the demands or the outrage that brought us into politics in the first place, to make sure that we never dim that light, but at the same time we strengthen ourselves by strengthening others who are fighting against it, against other oppressions. And I think the other point that was made was through that process, it's really, really critical to strengthen anti-racist organizing. I really agree with the point that was made that we have a long way to go. But I would also add to all this discussion that we shouldn't see electoral tactics as something separate or something that young people can't be part of. I completely understand that a lot of young people who are some of the most inspiring leaders are not voting age. But that's not so, yes, voting is the point, obviously, because we need to win the electoral campaigns as well. However, a lot of the fighting forces for independent left campaigns are going to come from young people. And whether you're voting age or not, we need young people out there fighting for truly genuine independent working class left campaigns. And we shouldn't look at this as an electoral versus building movements kind of strategy. That is a false dichotomy. We have to understand that we have to build power on all those bases. And it is the question of whether we run electoral campaigns has to be a question not of the moral purity of an electoral tactic, but of that moment, if that makes sense, if it makes sense to run an electoral campaign in a given context. And lastly, I will also point out that we should challenge ourselves in this idea that maybe people are voting against their interests. Yes, effectively they are, because neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are fighting for us, and we do continue to vote for them. But one thing is that indicates the complete absence of real choice. As long as we just have those two forces, we don't have any real choice. But secondly, and more importantly, we have to look at who's actually going to the polling booths. In this last midterm election, where the Republicans made gains, we had the lowest voter turnout since the Second World War. So what we are seeing is not so much a systematic process that people are voting against their interests. We're seeing a systematic process of people very rationally concluding there is nothing freaking to vote for, so I'm going to stay away. And it is that alienation that we have to tap into. Though they are looking for fighting forces, they are looking for battles that will actually take on the elite and fight in a bold and courageous and self-sacrificing manner. And we have to go to them, but the way we go to them is by taking a message of a united front and of concrete political and economic and social demands that they feel invested in and are willing to set their personal lives aside and fight for them.
Thank you. This is obviously just the beginning of a discussion. I'm sure the Left Forum is going to continue this at the next Left Forum. And if you want to see more of what's happened tonight, at The Real News, we're going to invite everyone that was on this panel to become on The Real News on a panel, and we're going to dig into these much more deeply. So this isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Thank you very much for coming, and goodbye.